There's a basement in Salem, Massachusetts, where the walls still whisper. Not in words, but in weeping. Behind bricks sealed with prayer and rot, 24 rusted beds remain shackled to the past. Each frame was built not to cradle sleep, but to restrain it, and beside each bed, a single offering, a cracked porcelain doll, a rosary, a blood-stained ribbon. The air smells of old iron and forgotten screams. On the stone wall, scratched by fingers too small to fight back, are 5 words. We are still here. You weren't supposed to hear that. You weren't supposed to know this story, because what happened in that academy was never meant for the light. The truth was buried, literally, inside a mason jar behind the altar, sealed tight by a hand that feared God more than guilt, until 1987, when workers renovating the academy stumbled upon it. And what they found inside shattered every notion of sanctuary, sisterhood, and salvation. This isn't just a ghost story. This is the story of how 24 orphaned girls were erased from history. Not by time, but by design. They were groomed, branded, sold, and silenced. And the ones who tried to speak, they didn't live long enough to finish the sentence. This tale isn't just darkness. It's rot, woven into lace and scripture. Welcome to St. Catherine's Academy for Young Ladies, where Christian charity met corporate trafficking, and purity was just a performance. What you're about to hear will never leave you. Not because it's frightening, because it's true. This isn't some storybook haunting. It's a blueprint of how innocence is weaponized, how systems are built to blind the public, and how predators wear halos when it suits the congregation. Cross the threshold now. So listen closely. Every detail matters. The dolls, the false kindness, the false God. We start with the woman who tried to speak, Elizabeth Hartwell, and what she found sealed behind a wall of silence. But before we descend fully, you need to understand something. Once you know what they did to those girls, you can't go back. Your worldview will fracture. Permanently still here, then step into the dark with me, because this is forbidden history, the kind that rewires your soul, and the Academy's waiting. Elizabeth Hartwell was not a brave woman by nature. She had no history of rebellion, no appetite for scandal. She was a teacher, the kind who believed discipline was kindness and that silence was grace. But in the winter of 1851, she found something that would rupture her very understanding of good and evil. Assigned to reorganize a supply room in the lowest level of St. Catherine's Academy, she expected dust, old blankets, perhaps forgotten hymnals. What she found was a wall that didn't match the rest. The brick was newer. The mortar, uneven. It wasn't curiosity that drove her. It was the sound, a faint clinking, like chains settling after movement. With trembling hands, she chipped through the facade, and when the wall gave way, what opened before her was not a room, it was a tomb for the living. 24 identical iron beds lined in rows like military coffins, each with shackles built into the headboards and foot rails, not restraints for the sick or deranged. These were designed for children. The mattresses were thin, brittle with age and bodily stains, and beside each bed, a token, small, heartbreakingly personal, worn-out hairbrush, a stuffed rabbit missing one eye, a girl's slipper. The air in the room was wrong, thick, sore, as if despair had soaked in the very stone and refused to die. But it was the wall at the far end that truly undid her, written in what appeared to be blood, and what confirmed every nightmare her conscience dared not imagine, were the words, "We are still here." Slanted, childlike, desperate. Elizabeth collapsed, not from fear but recognition. She had seen the names, taken roll calls, smiled at these girls. She had believed the stories, that they were placed in loving homes, that their futures were secure. But here were their futures, forgotten in chains. She tried to report it. First to the church, then the local council. But each door she knocked on only opened to polite nods and veiled threats. Within days, she was dismissed from the academy for commotional instability. No one wanted to hear her story. No one wanted the truth. So she wrote it down, everything, sealed it in glass, and buried it behind the altar, because some truths are too dangerous to say out loud. But some walls don't stay sealed forever. To understand what really happened inside St. Catherine's Academy, you must first understand the mask it wore. On the surface, it was a sanctuary, an elegant brick mansion crowned with Gothic spires, nestled on Gallows Hill Road, as if the land itself remembered what it meant to punish the innocent. It had the appearance of virtue, tall windows with white lace curtains, a chapel where hymns echoed, a garden tended by quiet girls in gray dresses. Salem's elite praised it as a beacon of moral rehabilitation. Ministers from both Catholic and Protestant churches applauded Mother Superior Whitman's selfless devotion. The mayor shook her hand and called her a savior. But it was a performance, a stage, and no one was allowed backstage. Not unless they were part of the script. And the girls, they weren't students, they were stock. Rebranded innocents, dressed for the marketplace of powerful men with untouchable names. The people of Salem didn't question why these girls never visited town, or why no parents ever returned for them, or why their laughter never echoed from the windows after dark. The girls moved through the halls with mechanical grace, conditioned to smile, to serve, to obey. Behind closed doors, punishment was ritual. Disobedience meant isolation. Speaking after lights out meant no food. And questions were sin. But this wasn't chaos. This was order. Cold. Precise. Engineered. The academy was not an accident. It was an institution built on silence, designed to convert trauma into discipline, and discipline into profit. The nuns, if you can even call them that, weren't holy. They were handlers. Mother Superior Whitman, regal and ruthless, used scripture like a scalpel. Sister Agnes Murphy ran the logistics. Papers forged, letters intercepted, adoption staged. Sister Margaret played the angelic mask, soft-spoken and maternal, earning the girls' trust before handing them off. And the church, complicit through omission. Because St. Catherine's didn't just exploit forgotten girls. It laundered sin. For the right price, secrets could be cleansed. A bishop's mistake, a senator's indulgence, merchant's shame, all quietly erased behind the academy's red brick facade. That's the real history of Salem. Not witches, not trials, but the quiet efficiency of evil when wrapped in piety. And all it took to hide it was one lie: their being adopted. But none of them ever left, because they were never meant to. The lie worked because it was exactly what people wanted to believe. A world gripped by industrial collapse, plagues, and poverty, St. Catherine's Academy offered a comforting illusion that the discarded children of the working class could be salvaged. Reform placed into the loving arms of God-fearing families. The public needed that story. It made them feel moral without lifting a finger. And so the lie was fed, year after year, printed on expensive paper with golden lettering. Refinement, placement, redemption. Those three words were repeated like holy scripture. But behind them was a transaction. Every girl who passed through those gates was converted into currency, evaluated, groomed, and sold. The ones who resisted, they were labeled hysterical, sent to the infirmary, drugged, or worse. You see, what most people never realized was that St. Catherine's didn't place girls in homes. They placed them in roles. Roles designed by the powerful. Roles built for silence. Some were sent to private estates where they became invisible servants. Some trained to entertain in secret parlors of Boston's elite. Others vanished entirely into the underground market of companions, for men whose names appeared in history books. But to make this system run, they needed more than girls. They needed obedience, and they manufactured it like a factory. Every morning began with confession, not to clean sin, but to extract shame. The nuns taught the girls to mistrust their own memories, to doubt their instincts. They were punished for crying, rewarded for compliance. Affection was rationed, given in whispers, withdrawn in storms. A calculated dance of trauma bonding. These weren't just orphans, they were broken vessels. Emptied, then refilled with roles the world applauded, docile, pious, feminine. And the world believed it, because the world wanted to believe it. Because to question what really happened inside that building would mean admitting that innocence isn't always protected. That sometimes it's harvested. And the Sisters of St. Catherine's were not saviors, were the architects of a silent war on the voiceless. Elizabeth Hartwell saw it. Emma Prescott heard it. But the town covered its ears. And now we dig into the archives they tried to burn, the truth they erased from every ledger and diary. But before we go further, know this: there is no turning back. Every layer we pull back is another veil removed from your own reality. Welcome deeper. In 1843, when Emma Prescott saw Mary O'Brien behind that brothel window, something inside her snapped. not from fear but from awakening. She had spent years stitching patterns into fine fabric, but in that moment she began stitching a darker pattern in her mind, a network of disappearances, silences, and shadows. The face she saw was unmistakably Mary's, but it wasn't the same girl she'd braided hair with in Lowell's textile mill. This Mary was painted, posed, and hollow. Her eyes, those wide, kind eyes, were now mirrors reflecting a horror too large to name. And the lullaby she sang, the one they used to hum during breaks to feel safe in the noise, it now echoed like a code, a cry. Emma didn't sleep for days. When she finally wrote to St. Catherine's, the response was quick and unnervingly sterile. Sister Agnes thanked her for her concern, insisted Mary was happy in a quiet Christian household, and urged Emma to move on with her life. But Emma had learned to read more than words. She read the signature. Someone else had signed that letter, someone trembling. That was when Emma made the decision that would mark her forever. She would pull the thread, slowly, quietly, and when she did, everything began to unravel. Weeks later, she saw Sarah Thompson, another adopted girl, being escorted by a man twice her age in a carriage gilded with arrogance. The girl wore lace and rouge and a terrified expression. That was the second thread. The third was the response Emma received when she wrote again. This time, it came not from Sister Agnes, but from Mother Superior Whitman herself. Cordial, deadly, she warned Emma, the most elegant prose, that continuing her inquiries might result in questions about her character. Curiosity, the letter said, is unbecoming of a lady without protection. That was no warning. That was a veiled death sentence. Because this was no longer about a school. It was a syndicate, a system, an operation with clients who drank wine from gold chalices, while girls like Mary and Sarah were passed around like collectibles. Emma had seen too much, and she hadn't even stepped inside the academy's walls. Yet you still think this is just history. No, this is a mirror, and it's beginning to show you something you've been trained not to see. Emma Prescott was alone. She knew it. And so did they. That was the point. Isolation is the first fortress of power. It silences dissent before it can become a movement. And Emma was dangerously close to becoming more than a seamstress with questions. It was becoming a witness. In 1844, Emma took a risk that could have gotten her buried in the harbor. She met with a local printer, one she trusted from years of business. She asked if he could discreetly look into property records for St. Catherine's Academy. The printer, curious but cautious, returned days later with something peculiar. The land deed had been transferred not to a church, not to a diocese, but to a private trust registered in Boston under initials WCF. A shell entity with no address, no human face. Emma asked around, digging carefully through city records, church archives, even whispered rumors at market stalls. What she found chilled her more than any apparition ever could. The academy was not part of any Catholic order, had no ecclesiastical supervision, no oversight, no sacred vows. It was private, independent, and protected. That was the moment the illusion shattered. St. Catherine's wasn't a religious sanctuary. It was a front. A holding facility for girls pre-selected, polished, and prepared for clients who paid not just for flesh, but for obedience. This wasn't just trafficking. It was curated captivity. There was a ledger somewhere in that building with names and numbers, receipts. But no one outside the circle would ever see it. That's when Emma began writing her own ledger. She documented everything: dates, sightings, letters, memories of each girl she knew. She started storing it all in a locked drawer beneath her floorboards. She told no one, because trust in a town like Salem was a luxury you earned through silence. She was no longer trying to rescue anyone. She was trying to survive long enough to leave a record, because that's what they fear more than exposure: memory. When the lie is too large to confess, they erase it. And those who remember become liabilities. You see, power doesn't need to deny the truth. It simply outlives those who carry it. Emma was now a clock, ticking, and they were listening. Are you? Good, because what comes next changes everything. There's a reason no one ever escaped St. Catherine's. Not one girl returned. Not one letter surfaced. Not a single trace. You'd think that over 17 years, at least one would have made it out. Just one. But that's the brilliance of systems built in shadow. They don't need walls when they've mastered control. And St. Catherine's had perfected obedience into an art form. The academy's architecture wasn't just functional, it was psychological. The girls slept 2 floors above the chapel, but never beneath the stars. Every window had reinforced bars, painted white to blend with the trim. The 3rd floor, always locked, wasn't storage, it was selection. That's where the special ones were sent. The pretty ones who learned to smile while weeping. On paper, it was a school. In truth, it was a market. A grooming center for men who wore crosses by day and became collectors by night. And the worst part, everyone, the mayor, the ministers, even the nuns in other parishes whispered rumors they never dared repeat aloud. Because silence was the price of peace. And Emma Prescott, she became a problem. In 1846, someone followed her home. She noticed footprints beneath her window, heard whispers behind her door. Once her cat was found hanged from a tree with a note pinned to its fur. Let the dead stay buried. But fear does something strange to a woman with nothing left to lose. It hardens her. She wrote one final letter, not to the academy but to the Boston police. No reply came. Weeks passed. Began to think the silence meant failure until October. That's when a man named Ashworth knocked on her door. Not a uniformed officer, but a quiet, plain man with calloused hands and the kind of eyes that have seen what others deny. He said only one sentence, "I believe you." And with those words, the game changed. Because Emma was no longer alone. The academy's wall of silence had just been cracked. You feel it too, don't you? That pull in your chest, that voice whispering, "This goes deeper." Good, because now we go underground, where the beds were still warm, where the names were still spoken, and where 24 girls waited for someone, anyone, to see them. Ready? Then follow me. For still, Detective Inspector William Ashworth wasn't a man easily shaken. He had seen opium dens masked as tea houses, child labor camps hidden behind textile factories, and bodies dumped in the Charles River like garbage. But nothing prepared him for what Emma Prescott had to show him. She didn't speak in hysteria or paranoia. She laid it out like a ledger. Dates, names, locations, descriptions of girls who had vanished. Girls who had supposedly found Christian homes, but were now seen whispering lullabies behind brothel curtains or riding in carriages with men whose colors cost more than Emma made in a year. Ashworth didn't flinch. He just listened, scribbled notes, and asked the right questions. That's how you knew he was dangerous. He wasn't hunting ghosts. He was hunting a system. He told Emma the truth, quietly, carefully, that for the last 3 years, bodies had been turning up in Boston Harbor. Girls, young, pale, refined, dressed in clothes far above their class. No families, but each one had a tattoo on her wrist, crossed with the letters SC, not a brand, but a signature. Ashworth knew this was no street-level operation. It was refined, ritualized. Every girl prepped, trained, delivered. There were no records because records would mean risk. He suspected a trafficking network operating under the veil of charity. But until Emma, he had no thread to pull. Now he had a needle, planned to stitch every name into the case file, until the entire curtain came crashing down. But they had to be careful. The men funding St. Catherine's weren't just wealthy. They were protected. Judges, clergy, businessmen, the kind of men who built legacies from silence. If they knew Ashworth was watching, he'd disappear like the girls did. So he created a masked Cornelius Blackwood, a wealthy merchant from the Berkshires, seeking a delicate companion for his invalid wife. And he made contact with Mother Superior Whitman, and she welcomed him, not with suspicion, but with familiarity, because predators always recognize their own. What happened during that meeting would reveal the true depth of the rot. But before we go further, I need something from you. Comment below the phrase, "The veil is lifting." Write it twice. Once to remind them you're awake. Once to remind yourself, because from this point on the descent is irreversible. Mother Superior Whitman greeted Cornelius Blackwood with the grace of a duchess and the cold precision of a banker. She didn't ask questions, didn't demand credentials. She offered tea and discretion. The parlor where they met was unlike the rest of the academy. No crucifixes, no icons, just velvet drapes, decanters of sherry, a silence so deep it almost hummed. Ashworth, playing the part, expressed his unique requirements. A quiet, obedient companion for his ailing wife. Young but capable, intelligent but docile, a rare combination. He watched her carefully, waiting for hesitation. There was none. Whitman smiled, folded her hands, and said, "We specialize in shaping girls to fit specific needs. Your preferences are not uncommon." Not uncommon. She said it like she was offering line-in options. Then she opened a ledger. Real. Handwritten. With the numbers, initials, and horrifying precision. Ashworth counted at least 60 entries. Some marked with dates, others with symbols. "These are not ordinary orphans," she said, voice smooth as silk. "They are refined, educated, unattached." No one asked questions and none returned. Ashworth asked if he could meet a few. Privately, he insisted. Whitman nodded. Of course. She arranged a viewing in a separate wing. Not the classrooms, not the dorms, but a narrow corridor lit by oil lamps and quiet as a grave. There, behind polished doors, were 3 girls. Catherine Murphy, Elizabeth Porter, and Hannah Clark. All teenagers. All perfect. Curtsied, smiled, said nothing unless spoken to. Their eyes, however, those eyes, screamed. Ashworth felt it in his spine. These weren't just trained girls. They were broken deliberately, programmed to obey, conditioned through repetition and punishment. And the elegance of it, the order, made it all the more monstrous. He left with a promise to send payment, but he didn't return to Boston empty-handed. He had names, descriptions, and proof. For the first time in over a decade, someone inside the system was documenting everything, but he also left with something else. Something that chilled him more than any brothel, any corpse, any criminal syndicate. As he stepped back into the carriage, one of the girls, Elizabeth Porter, looked at him. Her lips didn't move, but her eyes screamed one thing: "Don't forget me." And he wouldn't. He could, because once you see the machine, you either destroy it, or it devours you. Ashworth returned to Boston with more than evidence. He returned with a burden, kind of weight that bends a man's spine over time, not from guilt, but from the crushing knowledge of how deep the rot really goes. He compiled his report meticulously, not for the department. He couldn't trust them. Not yet. Too many names, too many eyes that looked away. Instead, prepared a sealed dossier to be delivered to a single judge he knew from the old days. One who hadn't yet sold his soul. But even that wasn't enough. Because the truth about Catherine's wasn't a single criminal act. It was a cathedral of crimes, built brick by brick with ritual and repetition. The abuse wasn't random. It was structured. Purposeful, a psychological conditioning facility masked as a school. These girls weren't just trafficked. They were transformed. Their identities stripped, their speech reprogrammed, their memories dismantled, rewritten, replaced with obedience and fear. It was trauma turned into curriculum, shame into scripture. Ashworth's notes revealed something even darker. Not every girl was chosen for sale. Some were kept, some were trained further, for specific clients, for private rituals. There were whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, about a hidden room beneath the chapel, a place not listed on any blueprint, a room of candles, leather straps, iron tools, a place where the highest bidders received more than bodies. They received submission, silence, total dominion. And those clients weren't faceless monsters. They were men you'd recognize. Bankers, bishops, senators, all cloaked in respectability. That's what makes institutional evil so indestructible. It wears the skin of virtue, sings hymns while it harvests innocence. And it always finds a way to bless its sins. Ashworth knew he was being watched. He started changing his routes, checking reflections, keeping a loaded revolver beneath his pillow. Because men like him, men who pull back the veil, don't live long in a world built on illusion. But he didn't stop. Because he understood something vital. Once you know, you carry responsibility. Not just to act, but to remember. Because memory is resistance, and silence is how empires of abuse survive. You're not just watching a story or becoming part of it. The more you hear, the less you'll sleep. Good. Keep listening. Because the next girl, she didn't disappear. She spoke. They made sure no one believed her. Her name was Hannah Clark, 16 years old, auburn hair, sharp mind, too sharp. She asked questions, not just about her adoption paperwork, but about the girls who vanished after being called upstairs. She wasn't like the others. She hadn't broken. Not yet. And that made her dangerous. The academy tried the usual tactics: isolation, cold baths, food deprivation. When that didn't work, they changed course. They sent Sister Margaret, the gentle one, the kind voice, the lullaby singer. She sat beside Hannah in the chapel and told her a story that God had chosen her, that her suffering was his test, that obedience would be rewarded. But Hannah didn't believe in that kind of God. She watched too many friends go upstairs and never come back. She watched Catherine Murphy scream when she saw a man's carriage pull up and beg not to go, and then returned 2 days later, empty-eyed and silent forever. Hannah wasn't stupid. She began writing in secret, tearing pages from hymnals and stuffing them into the lining of her mattress. Descriptions, dates. But someone noticed. Perhaps another girl, too broken to trust, whispered her name. Or perhaps Sister Agnes was watching closer than she appeared. Either way, one cold morning in March of 1848, Hannah Clark disappeared from the dormitory. The official explanation was that she had been placed early due to an urgent request from a generous Christian family. Some of the younger girls, still too innocent to understand what they were seeing, whispered about screams that night, muffled, choked, cut off. And the next morning, one of the mattresses was gone, burned in the backyard, witnessed only by one stable hand, who would vanish himself weeks later after mentioning it at a pub. But the story should have ended there. It didn't, because 3 months later, a letter arrived at the office of a Boston newspaper. No return address, just the words, "I was Hannah Clark. I am still alive." Inside was a page torn from a hymnal, written in a trembling hand, described girls sold like livestock, rooms with iron chains, a secret tunnel beneath the chapel. The editor dismissed it as a hoax, but Ashworth knew. He'd seen her eyes. Now he knew she was out there, somewhere, running, hunted, and maybe, just maybe, ready to talk. Ashworth read the letter again and again, each time slower, as if his mind refused to accept that she had survived. "I was Hannah Clark. I am still alive." It wasn't just a cry for help. It was a defiance, a spark, a ghost refusing to vanish. Within the trembling scrawl were details too precise to dismiss: the texture of the chains, the smell of mildew beneath the chapel, the pattern of footsteps during selection nights. It was her, no doubt. But more than that, it was proof. Someone had escaped the machine, someone who had seen the full anatomy of the beast and lived to write about it. But Ashworth also knew what this meant. The hunt was on. If he had the letter, then others might too. Intercepted, duplicated, traced. Hannah was no longer a girl on the run. She was a liability to a network that buried truth beneath marble altars. And so the race began. Ashworth left Boss Day under a false name, traveling by train, then carriage, then foot. He followed vague clues. Reports of a red-haired girl seen near the coast, a runaway in a church attic, a feverish orphan mumbling about tunnels and chains. He was always a step behind. But each rumor confirmed one thing: she was moving, and she was scared. Meanwhile, Stearns tightened its grip. The academy, sensing exposure, began destroying records. Witnesses disappeared. Even the girls who remained began to vanish in groups, relocated to facilities that no one could find on any map. Whitman gave public sermons about sin and salvation. Sister Agnes withdrew from view entirely. And Sister Margaret? She wept. Quietly. Alone. Not from guilt, but from fear, because Hannah knew things only the inner circle should have known. Names, symbols. The ceremony. You see, there was something darker than trafficking behind the academy's doors. Something ritualistic. Some clients weren't just paying for flesh. They were paying for submission under the guise of divinity, submission consecrated in silence, blood, and prayer. Hannah had seen it, and if she talked, if she named them, the whole system would collapse. That's why they were hunting her, not just to silence her, but to unmake her. Because if Hannah lived, their god of control would die. And Ashworth was the last shield between her and the abyss. The hunt for Hannah wasn't just a chase, it was a ritual, a cleansing. Because when institutions rooted in power face exposure, they don't defend themselves with logic or law. They sacrifice, they erase. They make the rebel disappear so the system survives unshaken. But Hannah Clark wasn't easy to erase. She had learned their language. The cadence of lies, the rhythm of obedience, the cold calculation behind every soft, spoken promise. And now she used it against them. She moved from church to church, town to town, always a step ahead. She wore plain dresses, called herself Maria, and kept to the shadows. But her mind, still sharp, still dangerous, in a small coastal town near Marblehead, found shelter in a convent run by aging nuns who had long since rejected the politics of the church. There, Hannah left something behind, not herself, but a testimony. 12 pages, written by candlelight, sealed in wax, and hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible. She didn't trust the living, so she trusted the dead. The nuns buried the Bible in a wall behind the altar, never speaking a word of it until decades later when the convent was demolished in 1912. But by then, the damage was done, because Ashworth had finally caught her trail. In a fisherman's shack near Gloucester, found what he was looking for. A girl barely clinging to life, feverish, bruised, starving, but alive. And in the firelight, she whispered it. The part that changed everything. Told him what was beneath St. Catherine's Academy. Not just chains, not just beds, but a room. A circular chamber carved from stone. No windows, no cross symbols. Symbols older than Christianity, older than Salem. Ritual markings scorched into the walls, candles that never ran out of wax, and at the center a pit. Shallow, stained, still damp. Thee said it was where God sees us, she whispered, but I think it was where something else watched. Ashworth didn't speak. He just wrapped her in his coat, because now he understood. This wasn't just corruption, it was worship. And the girls weren't lost, they were offerings. You still think this is about a school? No, it's about legacy, and the price of silence. Someone, something, was listening through the walls. It was never just about flesh, it was about surrender, the total annihilation of the will, shattered not for pleasure, but for power. What Hannah had seen beneath St. Catherine's wasn't the product of perverse men. It was a system built on an ancient blueprint, a ritualized architecture passed down through whispers, cloaked in scripture, protected by position. Ashworth had heard of such things in passing. Stories passed among foreign agents, rumors spoken in military corridors during late-night strategy sessions, cults embedded within institutions, orders that practiced old rites beneath new altars. But until now, he had no proof. Hannah's account changed that. She described the circular room in chilling detail. Every candle, every mark, the smell of iron, and the way the sisters, Agnes, Margaret, and even Whitman, would descend in silence, cloaked in black, speaking in tongues no child could understand. This wasn't Catholicism. It wasn't even heresy. It was something older. Pre-Christian, pre-language, an inheritance from before history was written. And the girls, they weren't just victims. They were keys. Rituals, according to Hannah, always happened on the new moon. Always at midnight. Always after a girl had been selected. She would be taken below, stripped of her name, presented at the center of the circle, bound, prayed over, sacrificed, not by blood, but by identity. Because once her will was broken, once she accepted what was done to her without resistance, something changed. The sisters would say the words, "She is no longer hers." And then she was ready. The clients who arrived after those ceremonies never asked for conversation. They asked for compliance. Perfect, unquestioning submission. And the girl they received was no longer the same child who entered the academy. She was a vessel, a product, and for the right price, a gift. Ashworth listened in silence, his jaw clenched, his eyes burned, not from anger, but from certainty. The system wasn't corrupt, it was ritualized control, hidden behind the veil of religion, philanthropy, education, a centuries-old blueprint for domination, passed through monasteries, orphanages, schools, and replicated, and again, and again. The worship order, Hannah whispered, her voice breaking. Not God, not justice, just control. And suddenly Ashworth realized what this meant. St. Catherine's wasn't the only one. It was just one altar in a much larger temple. When men hear the word cult, they imagine robes, candles, and unhinged fanatics dancing in the woods. But the real cults, the dangerous ones, don't look like that. They wear uniforms, they sit in pews, they pass laws, they print textbooks, and they build academies like St. Catherine's, where obedience is mistaken for virtue and silence is mistaken for safety. Ashworth understood this now. The academy wasn't just a corrupt institution, it was a node in a network, a single thread in a vast, invisible web of control. And Hannah Clark was the first to map it. Described how Whitman spoke of the order, not as a religious denomination, but as a lineage, a sacred inheritance. Those who joined didn't do so in rebellion. They did so out of ambition, out of fear, out of a hunger to belong to something above morality. The order didn't see itself as evil. It saw itself as necessary, quiet force maintaining balance by making decisions others were too sentimental to face. The exploitation of the weak, a necessary mechanism, the reprogramming of young minds, a societal investment, the destruction of innocence, a byproduct. Their mantra whispered beneath candlelight and granita, through discipline, we preserve the world. And Ashworth realized he was staring at the blueprint for modern control. Institutions that didn't just educate, they indoctrinated. That didn't just serve the vulnerable. They selected them, groomed them, sold them, not always in flesh, sometimes in allegiance, sometimes in labor, sometimes in silence. Hannah said there were other academies, not called St. Catherine's, but connected, some run by nuns, some by priests, by entirely secular fronts, boarding schools, reformatories, mental hospitals, but all bearing the same symbols: a circle, a triangle, a key, always hidden, always recurring. And within those walls, girls and sometimes boys were turned into products, programs, or pawns. And when they resisted, they vanished, just like the others. Hannah wept when she said it. We weren't supposed to survive. We're supposed to forget who we were. But she didn't forget, and neither would Ashworth. Because now the pattern was visible. Now the ancient machine was exposed. Once you see the levers behind the curtain, you either pull them down, or they pull you under. So tell me, are you still watching? Good. Because now comes the reckoning. Ashworth knew what had to be done. Couldn't go to the police. Half of them answered to the same judges who funded the academy's adoption programs. He couldn't go to the church. Whitman had deep ties in Boston's archdiocese, and whispers of her charitable success had turned her into a minor saint among the elite. The press, they'd call it hysteria, a grieving girl and a rogue inspector chasing ghosts. No, this had to be scorched from the inside. So he made a decision no honest man should ever have to make. He became one of them. For 6 months, Ashworth kept Hannah hidden in a rural safe house under the name Margaret Dell. She was still fragile, her mind riddled with trauma, but her memory was flawless. Together, they recreated the ledger she'd seen, not just names but dates, clients, locations. Each girl matched with a transaction. Each transaction matched with a man of power. Judges, bishops, investors. One name in particular sent Ashworth cold: Senator Elias Wortham, a moral crusader, the man who had once awarded Ashworth a medal for public service, a man who had praised St. Catherine's in public addresses, a man who had personally sponsored 6 girls, none of whom were ever heard from again. Ashworth didn't wait. He compiled a second dossier, one that would not be sealed in a safe but published, a map of the machinery, a mirror held up to the devils in clerical collars and silk gloves. And then he returned to the academy, alone. One final visit, this time not as Blackwood, but as himself, a man with nothing left to lose. He walked through the front gates with a revolver under his coat and a name on his lips: Hannah Clark. And for the first time in 20 years, Mother Superior Whitman looked afraid. She recognized him, but she didn't move, because she knew he knew. What followed wasn't rage, it was revelation. In the parlor, Ashworth laid the names on the table, quietly, one after the other. And with every name, Whitman's silence deepened. This wasn't a confrontation, it was judgment. And when it was done, Ashworth left a single note: the veil is lifting. He didn't look back. He didn't have to, because the reckoning had already begun. The veil was lifting, but the machine would not go down quietly. Within 48 hours of Ashworth's visit to St. Catherine's, strange fires broke out across Massachusetts. One in a diocesan archive in Boston's South End, another at a county records office in Essex, and most telling of all, a midnight blaze consumed a wing of St. Catherine's Academy itself. The 3rd floor, the locked floor, the one no visitor was ever allowed to see. Official reports claimed faulty wiring, but there was no wiring. The building still ran on gaslight. Ashworth knew what it meant: they were erasing the evidence. The network was burning its history. That meant the dossier had to be released, now. He didn't use the newspapers. Too compromised. Instead, he sent copies to 100 private recipients across the country. Journalists, lawyers, clergy, former detectives. Each package marked with the symbol Whitman feared most: the hollow circle with the cross carved through it. The same one seared into the wall of the ritual chamber beneath the chapel, and with the symbol, a phrase, "We are still here." It was a message for the girls who never made it out. But it was also a warning to the order: the silence is broken. At the same time, Anna disappeared again, not in fear, but by design. She knew that exposure made her more than a survivor. It made her a target, so she vanished into a network of safe houses established by Ashworth's old contacts. For the first time, she wasn't running, she was moving, strategically, with purpose. And in her place, whispers spread across the East Coast, of a red-haired girl who spoke of lost sisters, of a man with fire in his voice who called out judges in secret meetings, of symbols scratched into the pews of forgotten chapels. The system tried to cover its tracks, but the trail was already lit. Former students began coming forward. Not many, but enough. Enough to match names, enough confirm rituals, enough to terrify the institutions that once called St. Catherine's a miracle. Because now, the public was listening. Not everyone, but the right ones. And the order knew, once one temple falls, others will follow. They tried to label it a hoax, a myth. They said it was hysteria, folklore, urban legend. But what they feared most was that you would believe it, and now you've heard it. So ask yourself, why were they so desperate to keep it hidden? Because truth is poison to a system built on obedience. And once even one man drinks it, the entire illusion begins to rot. That's what Ashworth understood too late. Because while the world began whispering about St. Catherine's, while hidden hands scrambled to rewrite history and bury the ashes of their altar, something darker was unfolding. Replacements, new institutions, new names. You see, when darkness is exposed, it doesn't die. It adapts, it changes faces. It rewrites its mission statements, launches charities, foundations, child wellness centers. The architecture of control is hydra-headed, cut one neck and three emerge smiling. The order wasn't gone. It was evolving. Ashworth had disrupted a single temple, but the blueprint survived. And in Washington, Wortham was already working to funnel new funding toward moral rehabilitation schools. He gave speeches about lost youth and moral decay, all while wearing a golden pin in the shape of a circle with a tiny cross. Public, bold and unnoticed by anyone who hadn't seen the room, Hannah saw it. In a newspaper photo 6 months later, and she didn't cry, she smiled. Because the mask slipping was the first step. That's when Ashworth asked her to do the unthinkable. Tell it. Speak, not to the press, not to law enforcement, but directly to the people. Unfiltered, he helped her write a manuscript. A blend of memory, warning, and cold revelation. They called it the Academy, not St. Catherine's. Not a location, a system. The book wasn't meant to sell. It was meant to awaken. They printed 300 copies. Underground press, distributed through secret circles of educators, clergy, and resistance cells already suspicious of institutional power. And within a year, strange graffiti began appearing across the East Coast. On subway walls, alleyways, scratched into the backs of pews, "We are still here." No explanation, just the phrase, and a symbol. The order tried to fight it. But how do you kill a ghost? How do you silence an idea once it has entered the bloodstream of a generation? That's where you come in, because you've now seen behind the veil. You can't unknow this. You've heard what was done, so if you've made it this far, prove it. Comment below, "We are still here." We are still here, twice. For the girls, for the silence that failed to protect them, for the order that still believes you're blind. Show them you're awake. And now that you're awake, you start to notice the patterns. Don't you? The way some institutions operate like they're above scrutiny. The way certain figures, no matter what allegations arise, remain untouched. You notice the architecture, the symmetry of old buildings, the hidden doors in cathedrals, the basements that were never listed on the blueprints, the locked wings. You notice the language too. Phrases repeated across regions: moral rehabilitation, education, and corrective care. It's always about correction, never about truth. Because truth is chaos to those who worship order. And what happened at St. Catherine's was not the exception. It was a blueprint. And that blueprint still circulates in quiet meetings, in bloodline circles, in family estates passed down with their own unspoken commandments. Ashworth knew this. He once asked a man, an ex-bishop who broke ranks and confessed late into the night, drunk and trembling. Why do they do it? The answer was immediate, as it works. He wasn't talking about education. He meant obedience. He meant programming. You take the young. You isolate them. You destroy their identity. You offer salvation. You rebuild them in the image of control. That's the formula. And when you've done it long enough, when the technique has passed through centuries of quiet refinement, it no longer looks like abuse. It looks like discipline, like faith, like care. But underneath, it's the same ritual Hannah described beneath the academy. Strip the name, strip the self, replace it with silence, and call it mercy. That's why the order never died. Because the world, your world, is built on its principles. And if you really want to see how far it goes, ask yourself, why do elite schools have hidden donor lists? Why are some psychiatric hospitals still operating under 19th century laws? Why are certain locations marked private religious trust and immune to public inspection? You think this is history? No, it's instruction. It's transmission. St. Catherine's was a whisper. But now it's a voice. Your voice. Once you start listening, once you start seeing, the world is never safe again. And that's exactly what they fear. Because awareness is resistance, and resistance spreads. It spreads like fire in dry grass, quiet at first, almost invisible. A single man reads a book in the dark. A woman sees a name she recognizes buried in a ledger someone swore never existed. A girl in a boarding school dreams of iron shackles and wakes up with bruises she can't explain. These are not coincidences, they're echoes. Echoes of the system that once operated beneath the chapel of St. Catherine's. Because control leaves fingerprints. Even when wiped clean, the outline remains. And those who've been touched by it, who've seen behind the curtain, recognize the signs. That's how the new movement began. Not in protest or marches, but in quiet defiance. Secret circles of survivors who had no proof, but shared the same memories, the same symbols. They started to gather, to speak, to connect the dots the world had tried to scatter. They weren't trying to bring down governments. They were trying to reclaim their minds. And in doing so, they became the greatest threat to the Order's legacy. Because the only thing more dangerous than a secret revealed is a lie remembered. The Academy's downfall wasn't in the dossier Ashworth leaked. It wasn't in the fire or the scandal. It was in the idea that a single girl, stripped of identity, left for dead, could crawl back into the light and say, "I know what you did." That sentence is their death sentence. And now it belongs to you. Because here's the part they never wanted you to understand. The system doesn't need to continue. It only does because we comply. Because we've forgotten our power. Because we look away. But once you refuse to comply, once you speak the unspeakable, once you look into the dark and don't flinch, the ritual breaks. The spell lifts, and they lose everything. That's why you're still watching. Because something inside you, something ancient, remembers. You were never meant to hear this story. But now that you have, you're part of it. And part of you always was. The only question that remains is, what will you do with it? Because truth isn't a weapon, it's a key, and now it's in your hands. Ashworth didn't live to see the full unraveling. Men like him rarely do. He disappeared in the winter of 1853. No body, no note, no public inquiry. Just silence. Official record said he took an assignment in Europe. But the ones who knew better, Hannah included, believed something else, that the Order had enacted its final rite. Not a murder, a removal, ritual cleansing, erasure through bureaucracy, a name scratched off history's parchment. That's how the system preserves itself, not with blood, but with forgetfulness. But Ashworth had prepared for this. Before vanishing, he sent Hannah one final letter. It wasn't long, just 8 words scrawled in shaking ink. "Thee bury us because we know the map." And enclosed with it was a sketch, spiral drawn over the blueprints of the Academy. One that started beneath the altar and extended outward through invisible corridors, dead hallways, and sealed doors. The spiral wasn't metaphor, path, and she followed it. Not back to St. Catherine's, but to its twins, its mirrors. She found one in Vermont, another in coastal Maine. Always the same architecture, same wing reserved for special instruction. The same smiling headmistress with spotless records and lifeless eyes. And always a hidden door. The Order thought they were erasing Ashworth, but what they did was activate Hannah. She became mythic among survivors. The Red Witness, the one who returned. Her story passed in whispers through convents, shelters and prisons. She didn't seek revenge, she sought exposure. Not to destroy the system, but to reveal it. Because once revealed, it cannot return to the shadows. And now you've seen it. The spiral map doesn't just exist in buildings, it exists in you. In every memory you weren't allowed to question, every rule that made you smaller, every punishment disguised as love, you were trained too. Not as violently, but just as precisely. They may not have shackled your body, but they shackled your perception. And that's what Hannah gave back, not vengeance, vision. And vision, once awakened, cannot be silenced. So remember this, those who vanish aren't always lost. Some become the light in someone else's escape. Some, like Ashworth, become legends. And legends, unlike men, never die. But legends are dangerous, not because they're false, but because they remind us of a truth we were taught to forget, that ordinary people can become weapons against impossible systems. That revelation, more than any dossier or confession, is what terrifies the Order. Because if Ashworth became a legend and Hannah became a witness, what could you become? That's why they still hunt shadows, why old cathedrals hire private security for empty wings, why decommissioned orphanages are purchased quietly by shell corporations and repurposed into retreat centers. With new listed staff, architecture remains. Different names, different uniforms, but the corridors lead to the same end. Control. They know the spiral still works. But what they don't know is that it's been mirrored. The same way they map the path into obedience, survivors are now mapping the path out. It's not public, it never will be. Because exposure doesn't begin with protest. It begins with awareness, quiet resistance, slipping symbols into curriculum, embedding questions in sermons, printing fragments of the academy into pamphlets distributed at food pantries, women's shelters, veteran centers, places where forgotten people remember too well. Because this isn't just a story about 24 girls. It's about systems of psychological captivity. And if you look closely, you'll see the spiral even now. Your school, in your job, repetition, submission, silence. Those weren't quirks of strict religious life. They were rituals designed to break generations. And now those rituals have evolved. Digitized, sanitized, rebranded as therapy, discipline, structure. But beneath it all, the voice of Mother Whitman still whispers, she is no longer hers. That phrase didn't belong to the past. It warned the future. Because the great lie of modern freedom is that the cage was opened. It wasn't. It was just padded, painted, praised. But the spiral Hannah drew was a map out, step by step, memory by memory, identity reclaimed. And those who follow it don't just survive, they see. And those who see, they become contagious. That's why you're here. You didn't stumble into this story. You were summoned. And now you've heard enough to know you were never meant to remain asleep. Sleep was never safety. It was sedation, a soft velvet fog draped over generations to keep them docile, obedient, unthinking. The academy wasn't an outlier. It was a prototype, and the girls weren't just victims. They were test subjects in a ritual far older than Salem, far older than Massachusetts. A ritual of identity or assure masked as salvation. This was the Order's true invention, not trafficking bodies, but harvesting souls. And how did they do it? Through repetition, through isolation, through language. Words repeated like mantras until the self fractured and something else could be inserted in its place. The name they were given, the prayers they were forced to chant, the virtues praised, questions punished. It wasn't abuse, it was initiation. Hannah once described how girls were awakened in the middle of the night, marched down into the basement chapel, and forced to repeat the phrase, "I am not mine," again and again, until the voice stopped trembling, until the face showed nothing. That's when they knew the ritual was complete. That's when Whitman would say, "She is no longer hers," and the girl would disappear. From the dormitory, from the ledgers, from the world. Their identity scrubbed, sold, and reassigned. What's worse, some of them forgot they ever existed. And doesn't that sound familiar? Haven't you looked in the mirror and wondered why you feel hollow? Why some part of you, some instinct, wild defiance, was smothered so long ago you don't remember how it died? That wasn't an accident. It was design. It wasn't a mistake. It was a system. And every time you were told to stay quiet, to be good, to obey without asking why, you were standing at the mouth of the same spiral. Not in a Gothic orphanage, but in your home, your school, your church, your office. This is what they did to the girls. This is what they do to everyone. And now you understand this story is not history. It's prophecy. And prophecy doesn't warn, it summons. You've been called by the echo of the forgotten, not just to remember, but to awaken. Because if you don't reclaim your name, someone else will. And that's the true horror, isn't it? Not death, not violence, but the quiet, systematic theft of who you are. That's what happened in the cold stone halls beneath St. Catherine's. That's what the order perfected. Identity was never taken by force. It was handed over, piece by piece, by girls too broken to resist and too young to know they were being rewritten. And that same machinery is still running. Look around, look closely, look at how your society praises silence. Look at how your culture worships conformity. Look at how obedience is rewarded while questions are punished. That's not just a social pattern, it's a spiritual architecture. It's the spiral, still alive, devouring, and the language hasn't changed much. Good behavior, mature choices. Don't rock the boat. These are the shackles now. They're softer, cleaner, but no less binding. The modern version of Mother Whitman doesn't wear a habit. She wears a smile. She tells you what's best for you. She thanks you for your compliance. She rewards your numbness with titles, credentials, status. She invites you to erase yourself politely. And like the girls in the academy, you don't even notice what you've given away until it's gone. That's why the spiral was never just a physical map. It was a psychological one. And it's inside you right now. That's what Ashworth and Hannah wanted to warn you about. The external system is only half the trap. The other half is within. You can tear down the building, burn the altar, expose the names. But if you don't reclaim the self they taught you to abandon, then the ritual continues through you. Through your decisions, through your silence, through your compliance. So how do you fight back? How do you break the cycle? You remember. You remember what they told you to forget: your instincts, your rage, your right to say no. Reclaim your reflection. You say your name like a weapon. You stop being afraid of the dark, because the dark is afraid of you. That's how the order falls. Not in fire, in awakening. And it starts with one sentence said aloud, in defiance of everything they did to make you forget. I am mine. I am mine. Say it again. Not softly, not like a prayer, like a declaration. That's the moment the spiral reverses. That's the moment the programming cracks. Because the system can't control what it can't name. And when you reclaim yourself, you become illegible to their eyes. That's what frightened the order most about Hannah. Not that she escaped, but that she refused redefinition. That she spoke her own name when the ritual demanded silence. That she carried memories they tried to burn. She became what they could not contain: a mirror, a living reflection of their crimes. And she used that mirror like a weapon, turning it toward every locked wing, every smiling matron, every sacred institution that built itself on the backs of vanished children. She became legend not because she was perfect, but because she refused to vanish. And now so must you, because the academy was never just about 24 girls. It was about us. All of us who were broken and bent into shapes we didn't choose. Who were taught to smile through pain, to obey without understanding, forget who we were before they named us. But somewhere deep in you, you remember. Maybe it comes in flashes, maybe in dreams. Maybe it rises up as fury you've been told to medicate, to silence, pray away. That's not madness, that's memory. Ancestral memory. Because what was done at St. Catherine's wasn't just a crime against children. It was a ritual crime against the feminine spirit, against freedom, against the wild sacred self that refuses to kneel. That's why the order built their altars beneath chapels. That's why they sang hymns while breaking bodies. Because they needed cover, because they feared the divine in you far more than they feared exposure. And they were right to fear it. Because now that spark has passed to you. This isn't just a story you heard. It's a summons. And if you accept it, if you carry it forward, you don't just remember the 24 girls, you become the 25th. And this time you walk out, not as a victim, but as a fire. Fire doesn't ask permission, doesn't apologize for burning away rot. That's what becoming the 25th girl, or boy man, really means. You're not here to mourn the past. You're here to end the cycle, to walk back through every corridor of your life where you were made small, made obedient, made to believe that survival meant silence. And you're here to set it ablaze. Because the Order never expected this. They built their empire on two certainties: that the girls would never speak, and that the world would never listen. But you're listening now, and you're not alone. The echo of this truth is spreading through whispers in forgotten churches, through stories wrapped in fiction because the truth is too dangerous to print, through dreams passed between strangers who've never met but carry the same scars. This is how resistance always begins, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows, in quiet conversations, in questions asked by children the system thought it had already broken. Why don't we hear from the adopted girls? Why are the old wings of the school always locked? Why does that priest know my name when we've never met? These aren't just questions. They're cracks. Cracks in the polished facade of every institution that still clings to the rituals of control. And cracks, when multiplied, become collapse. That's what the new generation is doing. Not with remembrance, with stories, with symbols, with truth passed like contraband one soul to another. You are now part of that network, the underground library of forbidden knowing, the living memory of what they tried to erase. And here's what they'll never understand. Once a mind has been shown the spiral, it can't go back. It sees the pattern everywhere. In the curriculum, in the sermons, in the HR manuals, in the confession booths, and the recruitment slogans. And it refuses. That's why you're still watching. Because a part of you has already rebelled. And rebellion, when rooted in truth, spreads like wildfire, like you. So don't look away now. The map out of the spiral doesn't end here. In fact, the descent is only just beginning. There's a reason descent feels like awakening. Because the truth isn't found in the light, it's buried, deep, under decades of propaganda, under generations of silence, under cathedrals, dormitories, and so-called benevolent institutions like St. Catherine's. And those who dared to dig, they were punished. Branded as hysterics, heretics, conspiracists, or witches. The language changed. The intent never did. Erasure through discrediting. That's why you've never heard of Hannah Clark in history books. Why Ashworth's case files were misplaced. Why there's no monument for the 24 missing girls. Only rumors, buried testimonies, and shattered memories sealed in jars behind altars. Because the real monuments aren't made of stone. They're made of people who remember. And now you are one of them. That comes with a cost. You may never feel safe again in places others call sacred. May feel a chill walking into churches, orphanages, or corrective academies. No one remembers building. Because your body will recognize the pattern before your mind does. Your instincts will scream before your logic catches up. And that is your gift. That's what they tried to destroy in the girls. That primal inner compass that knows when something is wrong, even when the world says it's right. They tried to tame it, drug it, shame it. Shame you. But the moment you name it, the moment you claim your fire, the spiral begins to unwind. And that unraveling spreads, not as chaos, but as clarity. You'll see it in others. The men who carry silence like shackles. The women whose eyes look everywhere but the mirror. The children who've already been taught not to ask. And you'll want to save them. But don't start with them. Start with you. Burn the script they gave you. Question the voice that tells you to shrink. Ask yourself who benefits when you play small. Then say the phrase again in the comments. Twice, I am mine. I am mine. That's the ritual now. Not theirs, ours. Not to destroy history, but to reclaim what was stolen. Not to erase the past, but to become the future they never wanted you to see. Once you've said it, I am mine. I am mine. You've crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Not spiritually, not psychologically, not in the eyes of the system that fed on your silence. Because now you've named yourself. And they can't unhear it. The Order doesn't fear exposure, it fears recognition. Because once you see the pattern, you see them everywhere. Not in robes anymore. Not in candlelit basements. But in office towers. In nonprofit boards. Foundations claiming to protect the vulnerable. The faces change. The mission statements evolve. But the ritual remains. Grooming obedience under the mask of care. offering opportunity at the cost of self, looking control and charity. That's why institutions like St. Catherine's were never abolished. They were rebranded, their symbols diluted, their methods refined. Today, they call them reform centers, residential therapy programs, youth mentorship initiatives. But if you trace the funding, read the waivers, listen to the survivors who did make it out, you'll find the same spiral. Still turning, still hungry. Difference now is you. You are not food. You are not property. You are not raw material to be reshaped in someone else's image. You are a sovereign consciousness. And sovereignty terrifies them because it can't be taxed, can't be taught to kneel, can't be harvested. You are the breach in their lineage, the fracture in the ritual, the reversal. And it doesn't matter what they built if the foundation is now infected with memory. Your memory, the kind that burns through generations of lies. You are the curse whispered in their cathedrals. You are the ghost in their archives, the face that won't fade from their records. Because the moment you awakened, their future ended. No altar can protect them from a soul that has returned to itself. No amount of silence can drown out a voice that says, clearly, eternally, I am mine. And now the echo is spreading faster than they can contain it. It's not just you. It's men waking up in their 40s, realizing they were never allowed to feel rage without being punished. Women remembering the exact moment they stopped being someone's daughter and became someone's product. It's children refusing to say prayers they don't understand, asking why God needs obedience more than love. This is how it begins. Not with war, with remembrance, with questions that crack the polished surface of every smiling lie. And once those cracks appear, don't close, they spread. Through families, through cities, through generations, like a psychic wildfire. Because the trauma at St. Catherine's wasn't isolated, it was ritualized. And ritual trauma doesn't stop with one group. It becomes cultural, inherited, programmed. Your shame not yours, your silence. Taught, your fear of asking why. Conditioned. You've been walking through an invisible academy your entire life. Just cleaner, better lit, more acceptable to polite society. And now you see it. That's what they can't tolerate. Not violence, not rebellion, but sight. That's why every regime, every empire, every institution built on control eventually collapses. Because someone always opens their eyes. And now that you've opened yours, no longer on the outside of the story, you're inside it. You are what comes next, not a witness, a carrier. And the weight you carry isn't grief. It's inheritance. Carry the unspoken names of the 24 girls and the unnamed ones who never made it to the records. You carry Ashworth's spiral, Hannah's fire, Emma's question. And with them, you carry power. Power to name, to reject, to awaken others, and to never again comply. You don't need anyone's permission to burn the old altar. You are the new altar, not built with stone, but with memory, defiance, fire. And what you choose to worship there will determine whether the spiral dies in your hands or begins again. So choose carefully, because this moment isn't symbolic. It's sacred. Not the kind of sacred they fed you in catechisms and sermons. Not obedience masked as devotion. This is the older sacred, the forbidden kind. Kind they buried under cathedrals and locked behind confessional doors. The kind that turns victims into architects of truth. Because when you choose to carry the spiral, when you speak for the silence, don't just inherit their pain. You inherit their power. And that's what they fear most, that we'll stop mourning and start remembering. That we'll stop waiting for permission and start speaking in tongues they can't translate. Because now it's not about exposing one institution, it's about dismantling the psychological lattice that made them possible in the first place. The system isn't broken. It was built this way. The smiling social worker who tells a child they're lucky to be placed. The headmaster who calls discipline character formation. The executive who says we're all family here while demanding total compliance. These are not isolated abuses. These are modern rituals, polished, branded, normalized, and your refusal to participate in them makes you an outlaw in their theology. That's why this isn't just a history lesson. This is initiation. You've crossed the veil. You've heard what wasn't meant to be heard. And now your silence can't be bought. Your identity can't be sold. Your memory can't be rewritten. You don't owe them your forgiveness. You owe them nothing. You owe yourself everything. And in this moment, this exact breath, you're standing where the girls once stood alone, afraid, but aware. And what they needed, what every soul trapped in that spiral ever needed, was someone like you, hearing their story and choosing not just to listen, but to awaken. The fire isn't metaphor, it's your memory returning to you. And once it does, you'll never live in the dark again. Say it a third time in your mind or aloud. I am mine. Because from here forward the ritual belongs to you. And with that third utterance, I am mine, you sever the cord, not just from the academy, not just from the order, but from every invisible hand that ever tried to script your life without your consent. You are no longer a product of their programming. You are no longer a vessel for their guilt. You are no longer food for their rituals. You are sovereign. That word is dangerous. It was etched out of our language, buried under legal codes, erased from theology. Because a sovereign soul cannot be governed by fear. It cannot be bribed with belonging. It cannot be silenced with shame. That's why they didn't just need the girls to vanish. They needed them to submit first. Submission was the key. It always is. The girl who disappears screaming is a threat. The girl who disappears believing she was saved. That's a successful ritual. That's why the Academy's final command wasn't violence. It was love. Twisted love. We do this for your own good. Go on to your obedience. This is your sacred duty. You know that voice, you've heard it in different forms your whole life. From pulpits, from fathers, from institutions that claim to protect you. But now you know what it really is. Not love. Domesticated possession. And the only way to destroy it is to name it. Call it what it is. Ritualized erasure. Then watch it burn. Because the moment you identify the mechanism, you disarm it. This is why awareness is the highest act of resistance. Why remembering is a form of vengeance. Because if they cannot make you forget, they cannot make you submit. That's why you're still here. Because some deep, ancient part of you refuses. Refuses to play along. Refuses to forget the spiral. Refuses to give your soul to the system. The girls were never meant to be found. But you found them. You carried them back. And now you carry them forward. And so we end where it always begins, at the threshold. Between sleep and memory. Between silence and fire. Between the lie they gave you and the truth you were born to carry. You've walked the spiral. You've heard the voices they buried in stone. You've stood in the cold basement with the rusted chains, and you didn't look away. That makes you dangerous, because now you know the secret the Order spent generations trying to bury. Not just that they existed, not just that they harmed, but that you were never supposed to remember. The world is full of lost buildings, sealed archives, rewritten histories, but the memory lives in you. And that makes you the new archive, the living vault of what really happened. That's something they can't touch. You're not just the 25th girl. You're the first survivor who speaks without trembling. You are the first flame to walk out of the dark and say aloud what others died trying to whisper. We are still here. Those 4 words. They were scratched into the walls by hands too small to fight and voices too broken to scream. But they reached you anyway, because you listened. And that makes you the continuation, not of the pain, of the resistance. You are the new anomaly in the ritual, the break in the pattern, the soul that remembers itself. You were not born to serve. You were not born to obey. You were not born to vanish quietly. You were born to awaken. And now you've done it. So carry this story. Not with grief, but with power. Let it change how you see the world. Let it change how you speak, how you stand, how you refuse. And if they ask what changed you, don't name this channel. Don't name this video. Just say the truth they fear more than anything else. I remembered who I am. That's how we end their story. That's how we begin ours.